she's fantastic.
She's so amazing. Best boss ever. And
hot mic.
okay, yeah, sounds good. You can email it to me. Yeah, just one of those ones too big. Well, it's on the wireless. So if you have that HTML, just switch it over. Slides?
Lights?
Yeah. They're not showing up?
There you go. I'm gonna say the black and white headshot. Roll.
All right. Ready? Yes.
That's good.
Do we need to, is this
Can this look
directional
like
or does it matter? She does.
Near the
Like
maximum for the stream freeze.
Okay. How's that? Yeah, good. We can start. Okay. Buongiorno. Is it still buongiorno time? Hello, everybody. So my name is Candice Collison. I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism in Vancouver, Canada. I'm also the chair of the Bachelor of Media Studies program there, and I'm a regular contributor to Media Indigena, which is a crowd-funded podcast based in Canada. So the idea for this panel really comes out of a book project that Mary Lynn Young, on the end there, and I have been working on for the last several years that deals with gender, colonialism, and journalism in Canada and the US. We wanted to convene this panel with others who are working on similar issues, both in their journalism practice and academic research. So I'm going to introduce everybody first, and then we're going to take about 5 to 7 minutes each and respond to the question that's at the center of this panel. So right here on my left is Dr. Manal Matani. She's the founding host of Sense of Place and Acknowledgements, the story behind the story at Roundhouse Radio, based in Vancouver. She's the author of Mixed Race Amnesia and the co-editor of the edited volume Global Mixed Race. She's also an associate professor at the University of Toronto in geography and journalism. Beside Manal is Anita Lee, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of The Other Wave, a site dedicated to showcasing film, TV, and media from a diverse perspective, and she's the director of communities at Discourse Media, based in Vancouver. There's a theme here. Dr. Nikki Escher is next to Anita. She is an associate professor at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs, and the author of Interactive Journalism, Hackers, Data, and Code, and another book, Making News at the New York Times. The very end is Dr. Mary Lynn Young, an associate professor at UBC's Graduate School of Journalism and the co-founder of The Conversation Canada. So together, Dr. Young and I are co-authoring a forthcoming book titled Loose Methods, Journalism, Gender, and Tech in an Age of Colonial Reckoning. So for this panel, we've asked each of the panelists to answer the question that we posed in the abstract. And we're going to take about 5 to 7 minutes each to answer that question, then we'll open up for wider discussion. So the question, who is participating in imagining and shaping the future of journalism? The question of who is doing the shaping and imagining of the future is meant to enroll history as much as it does the present and future. Most analyses related to the last century of journalism in North America, both by academics and other commentators, have focused on the evolving dynamics of digital media in relation to economic restructuring, shifting audiences, casualizing of labor, and in the current moment, the proliferation of competing platforms and good, bad, and ugly news sources. And this makes sense, considering that newsrooms in most North American cities have become half or less of what they were in the heyday of the pre-digital 1990s. Yet what we want to bring into focus, both with our forthcoming book and this panel, is the ways in which persistent critiques related to gender, race, and colonialism haven't been well integrated into thinking about both how journalism is changing and how it might evolve in the future. In this sense, we want to move away from the mythology of techno-utopianism in media and the default ethical frameworks and justifications related to the fourth estate function that are defined by elite networks and knowledges. Instead, we're interested in rethinking how we get to ethical journalism in terms of stance, method, and practices. Specifically, the structures of how, whether, and when journalism is able to act as a surrogate for diverse publics in a global digital era. Technology in our framework serves not as a departure moment where potentially catastrophic change happens as a result of Facebook, Google, and others, but rather that new platforms and technologies associated with the internet serve as a diagnostic that provides insight into how ideals, professionalization, and journalistic routines, systems, and structures function, fail, and adapt. For the book with Mary Lynn, we've done fieldwork and interviewed journalists working with mainstream media, with media startups, and with Indigenous journalists. As well, for another research project, I've conducted ethnographic fieldwork and interviews with journalists across the Canadian Arctic. One of the key questions that has emerged in both these projects is whether there are different kinds of journalisms. And if so, who dominates? Who decides which one matters more, and which one, if any, should be protected by government? We're not talking here about non-fact-based journalism or doing away with the inverted pyramid. Rather, we're interested in what we're calling the looseness of journalistic methods. Underlying this are more basic questions about what kinds of knowledge journalism produces, what kind of experts journalists are, and whose truths are emerging through diverse journalistic practices and methods. Journalisms of the past have been centered on agenda setting and news judgment, of telling people what and how to think, of, in the immortal words of James Carey, providing strategies for selecting enemies and allies. Even whilst those whom we call the public must also negotiate their everyday life that may or may not be reflected in media representations, and often the realities are not reflected, particularly if they are poor, gendered, and or racialized. This is particularly true for Indigenous people in Canada, where historians have pointed out the ways in which Canadian print media has been consistently, over its 100-year history, complicit with colonial narratives and stereotypes. We argue that what we are witnessing is the emergence of multiple journalisms in North America that are built on ever-evolving digital platforms, transmedia configurations for content, new civic imaginaries for the role of journalism, civic epistemologies that now look closely at news sources, and newer norms and practices for local, national, and global audiences. Obviously, we can only present a thin slice in the few short minutes that we're here. So here's one bit. In our interviews, in particular with Indigenous journalists, and in many of my interviews with Arctic journalists as well, we have observed a differently described practice of journalism, where networks of relations form the basis for ethical considerations regarding a journalist's stance and methods for witnessing, reporting, and interpreting or contextualizing events. In contrast to the default objective stance of journalists, the ability to report, understand, and verify what's happening requires both locating oneself, situating one's knowledge and methods, and a grounded sensibility about the relations to which one is a part. Media technologies are seen as a tool for journalism to engage and represent the concerns of non-abstract, non-homogeneous audiences. Publics are invested, and the journalist's role is to both address the sedimentation of stereotypes and mis- or non-representation, as well as to address structural inequities and bring to light what counts as relevant expertise and knowledge. Specifically, Indigenous reporters in North America are more likely to provide a deeper context and more credible experts on the ground, and also to frame their stories as stories of resilience, of historical narratives repeating themselves even while acts of resistance persist. This means an implicit recognition of the violence of prior journalisms, as well as a re-articulation of their work as journalists as set within a different set of relations with technology, peoples, land, non-human relatives, cultures, and conditions for settler colonialism. Indigenous reporters are also unlikely to work in full-time positions in mainstream newsrooms. Examples of this can be seen on reporting out of Standing Rock, where mainstream media was very late to cover this protest, and Indigenous journalists like Jenny Monet were arrested with protesters. used social media and Facebook Live effectively to report on the encampment, and situated the use of force within a longer history of the use of state force against Indigenous protesters. Another example is reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which originated in part because Indigenous journalists like Tanya Talaga, Martha Troyan, and Angela Sterrett, who are at both print and broadcast outlets, compiled their own data and evidence to put together arguments about what was happening to Indigenous women and girls. More recently, beginning in February, Indigenous publics and journalists, like the group I work with at Media Indigena, pushed back against reporting by mainstream media on the deaths of 2 Indigenous youth, Tina Fontaine and Colton Bushi. Mary Lynn Young and I also did an op-ed about this for the conversation, and it's difficult to really briefly summarize the impact of the deaths of these 2 Indigenous youth. There were protests, there were court cases in which the alleged murderers were acquitted, in one case by an all-white jury that was selected specifically because they didn't want any Indigenous people in the jury. So this had a huge impact across the country. You can see the hashtags at the top if you want to look more closely. And mainstream media did a pretty poor job of reporting, in particular, on Tina Fontaine's case and on the trial into her alleged murder. So I guess it can probably best be summed up by a tweet from Jesse Wente, who is head of the Indigenous Screen Office. He summed up the persistent critique and newly configured power relations thanks to Twitter and other new platforms best when he tweeted out, "We see you, Canadian media." This is what we mean by invested publics, and it's in part why, as Jenny Monet put it so eloquently in a recently published essay on Medium, that Indigenous, and I would add Arctic journalists as well, can't give up Facebook. New platforms provide an alternative means of getting around and speaking over the kind of journalism that many mainstream organizations are so desperate to protect. And herein lies the conundrum, encountering fake news by shutting down or denigrating openness. Many of these newer platforms provide a kind of middle ground and a much-needed platform to both critique and counter mainstream news, and to provide alternative situated journalism to diverse publics that are hungry for narratives that are accountable within differently configured sets of relations that include land, non-human relatives, and the history and ongoing conditions of settler colonialism in Canada and the US. Thank you.
Need the sound, I don't need the video.
Oh.
No sound coming. But can we hear it? Sorry, 1 second, we're gonna make sure we can actually hear this clip that I'm trying to play for you. I can't hear any sound coming out of it. Maybe it won't work, in which case it is okay. Let's try it. Should we try it without it?
I'd like to see somebody else's desktop is as messy as mine.
Let's see if it works. There we go. I think that's loud enough for everybody, so I think we'll be okay. We'll give it a chance and see what happens. I think we're good. Okay, so the microphone is close enough to the speaker. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to begin by thanking the organizers, Candace Callison and Mary Lynn Young, for inviting me today. I feel honored to be on a panel with such esteemed scholars and journalists as well. So I want to recognize by beginning, by understanding at the start that we're talking about the politics of innovation as well today on this panel, and I was really excited to speak about that. And while I'm very interested in this idea of the politics of innovation in journalism, I want to explore a different relationship with you today, that is between innovation and infiltration. And I want to talk about why I'm interested in this idea of infiltration, particularly as a woman of color who works in journalism. I found it very difficult to infiltrate mainstream journalism, and I want to talk about why that's the case. The Black feminist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said something that's always stuck with me. She has said, as people of color, we have to infiltrate, then innovate. This relationship is very complex. I spent so much time trying to infiltrate that I haven't recognized that the very act of infiltration is a form of strategic innovation. As an Indian Iranian journalist, I've often been held up in journalism as what could be a happy-go-lucky emblem of a raceless future, a colorblind utopia that escapes racism. But that mixed race visibility is not mixed race power. I want to speak briefly about the damage of this future tense, particularly since I hear so much talk at this event about the future. And I think this future is indeed tense. It is tense and rife with silences when it comes to the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and startups in Canada. So I have a very unusual position in that I'm a professor at University of Toronto, but I've been on leave working at a station in Vancouver called Roundhouse Radio. Our staff is quite small, about 20 people, and our tagline is "Our City, Your Voice." I was invited to come on board as a mid-morning radio host for a show that I designed entitled Sense of Place. And everything that Dr. Collison has spoken about so eloquently are the things that I was trying to bring into my program. The show is definitively anti-racist, definitively anti-colonial, and I make no apologies for this whatsoever. It is definitively feminist. As a former associate producer at the CBC and TV News, I'd witnessed the ways that decisions about representations were made under the continuous ritual and rigid restraints of a racialized gendered hierarchy. So of course we know, in the colonial order of things, anti-colonial stories are always threatening. They threaten because they position the teller outside the realm of the objective commentary. So my focus was on the specificities, identities, worldviews, representation, and agencies of the colonized, with a focus on the idea of mobility, intimacy, and movement. So the show became called Sense of Place, which won't come as a surprise to many of you given that I'm a feminist geographer. It offers a way to think about denaturalizing and de-essentialing ideas, beliefs, and firmly held associations with identities that we wanted to dislodge. We all know nothing happens on a head of a pin, it happens someplace in space, and I wanted to think about how stories become mediums to unmake colonial borders. And Siam and Rizkes remind us, the land is more than a backdrop, space, or location. It is a sustainer, speaker, and archive for decolonized stories. So I encouraged my staff to take new risks. What did it mean to rethink relations in journalism, to explore the possibilities of a quiet or a not so quiet revolution towards a duty to repair in intimate radio conversations through critical mobilization of feminist forms of knowledge mobilization? I turned to Toni Morrison for a lot of inspiration when I was developing this show, and she says her project is an effort to avert the critical gaze from the racial object to the racial subject, from the described and the imagined to the describers and imaginers, from the serving to the served. So my job, as I saw it, was not to provide a voice for the voiceless. This facile interpretation positions one as a liberator of voices, and that is not my job. To do so reveals the very height of white benevolence and privilege and reinforces systemic institutionalized oppression of media forces. It also assumes that there is a they that doesn't have a voice and that you do. It assumes that individuals do not have agency and sets up a hierarchy between you and them, another binary that I think we need to dislodge in journalism. I was very influenced by the work of Arundhati Roy, who a lot of you will know. She says there's no such thing as a voice for the voiceless. There is only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And that's worthwhile repeating, I think. The deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. So to begin to approach this idea of an anti-colonial response in sound and journalism, a revolution in relationality was required on my program, and I say this most plainly through thinking about what I call the coloniality of the interview. I think about how questions always gesture to a pre-existing saturation point of privilege and power, questions as cage. And I was trained so much at the CBC to think about how to ask a great question, and this one question that's always stuck in my mind: what do you mean by that? making the guests repeat themselves over and over again until we get the clip that we want, this perfect clip, until we hear what we want to hear. And for years, I thought this was a brilliant question, but now after doing interviews with countless Black, Indigenous people of color on my radio show, I'm not so sure. What do you mean by that? The burden of extraction impossibly placed upon our interviewees, because of course they're seen as our interviewees, right? Our property. With us forcing, dragging, pulling the information we so violently demand from them, wrenching it out from under their tongues, like blood-stained molars from their mouths, that process of extraction at the heart of colonial practice. We refuse to meet them on our own terms. So what would it mean if we met them at their terms? We refuse the risks of danger, opportunities of egalitarian intimacy. So I want to end today by sharing with you a bit of an interview I did with Salman Rushdie. And it was an interesting interview because he didn't come into the studio for all sorts of reasons that a lot of you will appreciate. But I still had a very thoughtful conversation with him when he came to Vancouver. And I want to share with you what he said. We talked about the themes of risk, relation, revolution, and repair, which are the building blocks for my program. And I want to share with you what he said about his new book, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it here. But first, we got to make sure it's playing. See. Yeah, it was working a second ago. It's funny.
Maybe just
Yeah, maybe just let it.
play with the mic.
It's not even playing though on my computer.
So unplug this maybe.
Oh, unplug this. Let's try that. Sorry, everybody.
I'm trying to think how best to answer that.
Okay, here we go.
One of the things I think, and one of the things I think about the character.
I want to make sure that we talk about the issue of repair before we end today. One of my favorite lines in the book is again uttered by Rhea, who says that my field should be a soft space, a soft, safe place for understanding. Instead, it's a war zone. I choose peace. And I wanted to ask you, how do we do that daily through the process of repair? What does that look like for you, that process of repair?
I'm trying to think how best to answer that. One of the things I think, and one of the things I think about the characters in this book, is that we are all damaged. You know, life damages the living, and the people in this book carry with themselves various forms of damage, and try and live the best lives they can in that, carrying those wounds, and if they're lucky, they're able to heal. If they're extra lucky, they find somebody who can help them heal, or they find a place that is nourishing, or some kind of activity that is reparative. But I do think it's the story of human life, that we are all beaten up by life, and we all carry those bruises. Some of us to a greater degree than others, and certainly one of the great subjects of literature is how human beings deal with that.
So that freight of stories that Salman Rushdie is talking about made me think more about the subtle act of repair, that I think that's something that we're all invested in here today. I choose repair deliberately over other R words like reconciliation and reparation, as if such practices could ultimately exist. A focus on the strategic efforts of infiltration allows for a glimpse of innovation in practice, or what Stephen Jackson calls broken world thinking, creating space for the contemplation of breakdown, dissolution, and change, rather than innovation, development, or design. A deep wonder towards understanding the subtle acts of repair by which rich and robust lives are sustained against the weight of seemingly insurmountable odds. Thank you very much.
Do you mind if I borrow this?
Awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Anita Lee, and I'm the Director of Communities at The Discourse, which is an investigative Canadian media outlet based in Vancouver that practices solutions journalism. So what does that mean? What is solutions journalism? It means that we don't think we're fully doing our jobs if all we do is point out problems. We also have an obligation to illuminate possible paths forward, to move people from dismay to possibility by reporting on existing solutions to systemic problems. We also test out new approaches to storytelling that go beyond the conflict-driven daily news cycles that you typically see in mainstream media by producing investigations, analyses, data journalism, and more focused on our main beat areas. And the main beat areas that we cover are gender, reconciliation, the environment, child welfare, and sustainable development. We publish work on our own digital platform, the discourse.ca, which we will see up here. We recently rebranded from Discourse Media to The Discourse. And we also publish with media partners, including Canada's The Globe and Mail, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, and The Guardian. So The Discourse isn't an advocacy organization, but we approach our journalism within an anti-colonial and gender-based framework. Why? Because Canada's media industry suffers from systemic forms of discrimination, and we want to combat that. Unlike the US, where the American Society of News Editors has released an annual report on newsroom diversity since 1978, Canada doesn't actually keep a consistent tally of minority representation in newsrooms. In fact, our most recent data is from nearly 2 decades ago. And in 2000, only 3% of Canadian journalists in various media were visible minorities. And in 2004, only 3.4% of newspaper staff were minorities. And that's despite the fact that Canada's population is made up of 20% visible minorities. As a result, the status quo in Canadian journalism was created and continues to be perpetuated by one homogenous group of gatekeepers. This means historically, legacy media organizations haven't generally produced coverage that's genuinely representative of Canada's diverse population. It also means that certain approaches to journalism have become entrenched. For example, prioritizing competition over collaboration, even though collaborative efforts between journalists, such as the Panama Papers, have been very successful, and also maintaining an uncritical embrace of objectivity or balance. We at The Discourse want to establish new best practices from the ground up that are genuinely inclusive. We knew something was broken, so we wanted to fix it. So how are we going to do this? Discourse journalists do this by listening carefully to communities before reporting. We involve our audience in the choices we make about our coverage, and we participate in conversation and stay with stories even after publication to deepen impact. We also try to find ways to make complex information available, accessible, and engaging. So I want to direct your attention to this slide, this quadrant, and this reflects typically how most traditional media organizations produce content. The journalist reports, writes, edits, and then moves on to the next project, but they don't tend to keep up with the story after publication, and they don't engage in conversation with their audiences. So there's a lot of untapped potential there. On the user end or the reader end, they don't engage with the story until after publication happens, at which point they consume, react to, and share the content. So there's a lot of opportunity for users and readers to inform a media outlet's editorial process by providing feedback and resources prior to publication. And there's a lot of opportunity for journalists to deepen impact by following up on the topic and engaging in genuine dialogue with their readers. And this is from The Guardian. So also unlike the traditional news model, we don't consider content our primary work. Rather, we see discourse as being in the community engagement business. We see trustworthy journalism in the public interest as a byproduct of successful engagement with citizens. So in other words, our journalists work for you, the public. Our reporters focus on beat areas to allow them to develop close relationships with the communities they report on, and they develop a level of expertise and understanding in the subject matter. We're constantly thinking about how we can better connect with communities and whose stories are going untold. So as I said, we recently launched the beta version of our new website, which is called thediscourse.ca, to optimize it for community engagement. Our goal is to build Canada's largest community of engaged citizens through a membership-based service. So a membership model is different from a subscription model with a conventional paywall, in that members don't pay for the content, but they pay to be part of a community of like-minded people who want to affect change in the world and who also want to engage in productive conversations, because you don't typically see those online anymore. Because our journalism serves everyday Canadians, we want everyday Canadians to own the discourse. which results in truly democratic media that isn't controlled by media conglomerates. The discourse.ca naturally has an anti-colonial and gender-based framework to it because our diverse members can deeply engage with our editorial process and inform our journalistic content and approaches, which means a wider variety of perspectives are considered in our coverage, particularly marginalized perspectives that have historically been overlooked by mainstream media in Canada. And since we want to include all Canadians in our national conversation, we don't want to prevent people without the means to access our site from accessing it, which is why members are able to access our site for free if they don't have the means to pay for a membership fee. And there's also an option for people with greater means to be able to sponsor people who can't afford the membership fee. Now I want to give you some specific examples of discourse work that take an anti-colonial and gender-based approach. The first you see up here is a comic explainer, which is part of a broader investigation that we're doing into Canada's First Nations housing crisis. On the left, you'll see that an explainer that describes what it's like for Indigenous people living on reserve, what it's like for them to access housing. On the right, you'll see what it's like for non-Indigenous people living off reserve, how they access housing. So our lead reporter on the story, Francesca Fionda, who's a data reporter, consulted various stakeholders prior to creating the comic explainer, including academics living on reserve, as well as First Nations housing managers, to see if this piece would provide value to the communities we're covering, because we're constantly questioning whether, a lot of the times journalists just pop in and pop out of communities without providing value to the communities they're reporting on, so it tends to be exploitative. We also want to make sure that we're lowering the barrier to entry so that the broader Canadian public can understand this complex issue. In info box, we also acknowledge the multi-generational trauma of Canada's residential school system, and Wamish Hamilton, who's a reconciliation reporter and also contributed to these explainers, mentioned in his recent newsletter that we featured an Indigenous character with braided hair, you can see up here, because of the fact that it's a symbol of Indigenous cultural empowerment. So we really tend to think through how our stories are conveyed to the public and as well as to the communities we focus on. Another component to this investigation is a 360 documentary that I'm producing, where we plan to enter the home of an Indigenous family with their consent to show a slice of life of their daily lives, but also to show the barriers that they tend to face in housing. So that includes overcrowding, mold, and more. But because we recognize the fact that virtual reality can veer into the voyeuristic, and because of the fact that we recognize that First Nations have historically been exploited by mainstream media, we've been trying to earn the trust of the communities that we plan to enter by requesting permission from their band councils and offering something of value to the communities. So for example, in exchange, I plan to possibly host a VR journalism workshop in the communities that we're entering. Another example of work that we do that takes an anti-colonial and gender-based approach are our newsletters. So Brielle Morgan, who's our child welfare reporter, has discussed decolonizing media in her newsletters. Meanwhile, our gender reporter, Emma Jones, has recently talked about why Discourse CEO Erin Miller and Discourse's funding model are inherently feminist in her newsletters. So our anti-colonial and gender-based framework also informs the Discourse's organizational structure, because we recognize that a consensus-based and a collaborative approach, as well as a flatter hierarchy, empowers staff from marginalized communities who've historically been brushed aside to share their perspectives in a safe environment. So to conclude, being more inclusive is definitely a challenge, but we've already seen the benefits of our approach in the form of better journalism, more innovative journalism, as well as higher engagement from the Canadian public. And if you're interested in learning more, I can suggest some helpful resources, so you can come see me after the panel's done. Thanks so much.
Should we do a Mary Lynn and switch so that way we don't have to? Yeah, let's do it. So, what you don't know about Mary Lynn is she believes in kinesthetic pedagogy. So, let's just. Whoa, should we move? Yeah. Easier.
Are we moving?
Yeah? Oh, okay. So I just want to say I feel like I've traveled 50 years from this morning, where I was sitting on a panel about, can you have social theory in journalism? How can academics inform journalists to do better work and to question power? And I think sitting right here at this table are amazing, badass ladies who are questioning power by doing journalism and by doing it in a way that is informed with social theory. So you guys are just super duper inspiring, and you know, this is why Americans fetishize the Canadians, just so you know. I mean, like, the idea that we could even have a reconciliation journalist as like a word, I've never heard reconciliation journalist before. So what I wanted to talk to you about, shameless book promotion, but actually a reflection on actually writing this book. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I've been calling the STEM journalism, to be a little bit more inclusive than just talking about data or interactives or coding. But I'm thinking more about sort of anything that you would consider the fusion of STEM into journalism, so that encompasses tech startups, right? So in any event, that certainly wasn't a term that I had come up with when I wrote my book. But also, I wrote this book and I didn't interrogate gender. And part of the reason I didn't interrogate gender was that I had decided it wasn't my question, right? Which is a convenient academic excuse. But part of the reason was that I was already facing such difficulty in not being a technical expert myself, but studying a group of technicians. And so that was very much gender, much male-gendered, really. Like and so starting from that imposter syndrome and then questioning further questions about disempowerment was almost just a little too much. So now I can be more reflexive after having done the research. So I can do that now, and I'll share a little bit about that. But it doesn't mean the book isn't good, and you should get it anyway. So I just want to give you like a little sense of sort of how journalism has become a little bit more inclusive with a little bit of like a US twist. So 1995, one of the first NICARs, right, the premier data journalism conference, at least in the Western, sort of North American hemisphere, right, didn't really have women present. In fact, there were about 8 or 9 women. So they used to be able to all fit at a table, and they called it the Women of Car Dinners. So, 8 or 9 women for the first 5 or 6 years of people really learning to do computer-assisted reporting. And so I think this quote really encapsulates it. I didn't feel like they were trying to exclude women. It's just the way it was back then, and that there just really weren't women there. You see this representation of sort of the lack of women as leaders of data journalism, of interactive journalism, of the STEM fields, as this has become more valorized. So the beginning of this narrative of journalists saving the news through data or through interactivity began as a predominantly male narrative. And this is from 2009. It's from New York Magazine. There are people here at this conference, including Erin and Drew, who no longer work for the New York Times. But this is like the male face of the people saving journalism through STEM, right? And this has gotten better. But I actually think the fact that it's gotten better maybe raises more problems than we might want to acknowledge. So this was the gender breakdown of the NICAR 2016 speakers, and you can see that men roughly outnumber women by, 3 to 1, 2 to 1, right? 2 to 1. And then the gender breakdown of the NICAR 18 speakers was much closer to parity. So props to the NICAR conference for doing a great job in recognizing a problem and in over 2 years really showing change. What I did not do in this analysis was look at the division between hard coders and gender and sort of more soft skills like strategy and gender, right? And so that would sort of be a secondary analysis that you'd want to do to really see if that parity is improving. But I want to say that this also raises problems. So open source, which is what a lot of programming journalism has embraced, it has built-in inequities, problems that are really difficult for women. And the first is that because open source is premised upon free collaborative labor, for people to advance, a lot of that open source ingenuity happens outside of the space of work. It happens at home. Well, guess who's doing the majority of emotional labor and childcare? Women, right? So in their spare time, in addition to doing one form of unpaid domestic labor, they are now doing another form of unpaid actual labor as a cost of advancement, right? So I like this quote from a post on tech.co. Open source is supposed to be our passion, something we work on even in our spare time, right? And we talk about community and collaboration. And to walk away from a project seems somehow selfish. But this is something you do in your spare time, right? Which is already sort of has problematic gender issues. But the open source community itself is pretty toxic to women. And so this post was about how open source is just as toxic as many other technical cultures. So I like this quote, even though I don't like it. The developer told me, as a woman developer, that I was being too emotional, right? And you hear that damn discourse over and over again, right? But it's present in the form of software that is seen as transparent and open, right? That undergirds a lot of the philosophy of sort of the STEM work in journalism, right? And I think this sort of idea of open source and free labor really gets to it, right? Isn't it kind of weird to expect people to do work outside of work as a basic requirement, right? And that is sort of one of these endemic problems. But journalism has moved on more. STEM in journalism is more than about data journalism. It's more than about coding to tell stories. And it's moved into increasingly a model of where media companies look more like tech companies. And you see this a lot at the startups, right? So Vox is a good example where product, editorial, and business are all sort of created as equals. But you start to see these gendered problems that are already in tech culture bleeding further into journalism. So in a paper I wrote, I spoke to a product manager who had this to say, you have to represent being a woman and all those other identifiers that are underrepresented in tech and journalism, and that is often harder than the work itself at hand, right? So by being not only in a bridge role, but by being different from what you expect, that's another form of emotional labor that gets added to the practice of work. Right? Alexis Lloyd, who ran the New York Times R&D lab, is somebody who builds prototypes. She is in product, and she had this to say: let's please stop using your mom, my mom, as a proxy for the technological illiterate. Half of the moms I know are designing apps and shipping code. Right? And this gets to sort of this endemic discourse. So as women are becoming increasingly part of project management, they're also, right, or creating products, technical products in news, right? There is still an endemic sexist discourse that is really hard to fight against, right? And then lastly, right, as news is changing its funding model and people are looking for new and interesting ways, right, venture capital has become an opportunity for news organizations, right? But the problems in venture capital also find themselves endemic in journalists trying to seek to create VC-funded companies. So the stats are a little better than they were 3 years ago. 7% of VCs will invest in women out of the total portion of VC money, and that's 2017. It was 2 to 3% in like 2014. That's really bad, right? And just as a sector as a whole, the number of investments given to all male teams for every one investment given to a woman-led startup is 6 to 1, right? This is not good, when you start to think about the equal opportunities for innovation. I think Emily Bell saw this very early on in 2014. Journalism startups aren't a revolution if they're filled with all these white men. And so I think that what I want to raise awareness of, and this is just one slice, right? It's not a particularly intersectional look at this, but as journalism becomes more STEMmy, right, it raises itself open to the vulnerabilities of that technical culture that are really easy to critique, and we really need to guard against that. But there's, you know, as I showed you, it's not as bad as some other places, right? NICAR has a self-consciousness that women are important. But the real sort of strange worry that I have is if journalism becomes the STEM space for women that is actually the most comfortable, which is what a lot of women will say, then is somehow the fact that women are not comfortable in elite programming jobs and moving to journalism really holding them back because their earning power is undermined, right? They can't make those big dollars by being a programmer at a big tech company, so instead they go to a newsroom. So I just wanted to be a little bit provocative and raise the issue of gender within journalism in the STEM field in this particular context. So hopefully I've given you something to think about.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming at the end of the day to hear this panel. Wow, I really appreciate you being in the audience. And good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with this panel of incredible scholars and journalism leaders. So I'm wearing two hats here today. I am both the co-founder of the Conversation Canada and spent a number of years trying to fundraise for its launch, as well as an academic. And so the Conversation Canada is one of the few national not-for-profit digital pure-play startups that has launched in Canada since 2000. So it's been an exciting time. We launched actually in June earlier in 2017. It's part of the Conversation Global Network of sites. You may have all seen it or kind of run across it in your travels, which is a source of news and views written by academics and edited by senior journalists. I'm also a scholar researching gender, colonialism, innovation, and journalism as a part of a book with Candace that she mentioned earlier. And I came to both of these projects from similar questions, both how to understand and disrupt systemic inequities in journalism. I use the term disrupt deliberately because it's been largely deployed in a technology context in journalism. And in our book, we want to think more broadly about what is innovation in journalism and who are the innovators. That's because we've been using a narrow conceptualization of the term disruption, focused largely on tech, leaving people and important concerns out of the conversations. This approach is also overly optimistic and partial. It's overly optimistic for two reasons. The first is a singular notion of technology as instigator of transformation and savior suggests compliance with long-standing and well-critiqued technology as progress narratives. Second, research shows that organizational habits and cultures, Lucy Kung talked about it yesterday, are very difficult to change. It's also partial because newer technologies, while potentially innovating forces, have been shown to co-produce existing structural power relations when they're deployed. For example, research Candace and I completed on a new startup founded and run by women found that they had a hard time claiming the innovation in journalism space as part of their value proposition and contribution to journalism. And this had an impact on their sort of ability to see themselves as the real innovators and leaders that they were. This professional identity challenge at one site in an emergent area at a time of women's increasing presence in news is less than surprising, however disappointing. Many of us will be familiar with a large body of literature from prominent scholars identifying gender bias, racism, and colonialism in journalism. A number of panels at this conference touch on those themes, and there was another one about feminist journalism, and I see the speakers in the room earlier today. Thank you for coming. They shared their wine last night. Thank you for that as well. We also need to start to link these themes with technological adaptation in journalism, answering questions such as who is in the room and who is shaping and imagining journalism's future. Specifically,
What is journalism claiming it can and should do to facilitate democratic engagement and to speak to and for various publics in a globalizing world? In my national context, as Anita so well described, newsrooms in Canada, the who is particularly problematic and an important concern as journalists remain persistently white. Some of the roots of this narrowing can be found in how this digital period has been understood within journalism. And here I reference a number of scholars' work on the crisis, or how the crisis in journalism has been constructed. Stiles and Buskowski, Robert Picard, Barbie Zelizer. They question the academic and industry accounts about the causes of the crisis and its solutions. These include, and I'm referencing their work, ahistorical understandings of trends in journalism, and a focus on a number of limited causes. Those causes include, and I'm sure you're all familiar with hearing them, and maybe even unfortunately living them, outdated business models, declining advertising revenue, excessive profit motive, and technological change. They also identify similar approaches within industry, such as pundits drawing from and using anecdotes to tell stories about decline, and being more concerned about journalism jobs, which are extremely important, than in addition to the social impact of this change. They also indicate that recent studies methodologically tend to draw from existing industry sources. And as former journalists or journalists, we all know what that means in terms of how it can shape coverage. The result is an understanding of the crisis of this digital period in journalism from a defined set of sources and/or solutions. For Picard, this orientation results in restorative nostalgia for a journalism age that never was, self-interest, and shifting alliances. We're seeing similar narratives play out in Canada with a small number of prominent legacy media leaders diagnosing the challenges and opportunities for the country's journalism organizations and able to lobby for policy change and/or government funding. And again, Anita talked about the national studies. A recent study from 2011, and the seat kind of in center of media power in Canada is Toronto. So a 2011 study that looked at diversity in media leadership in Canadian newsrooms in the Toronto area found that only 4% of media decision makers and leaders were, 4.8% were visible minorities. So these leaders who are at the center of this analysis and the crisis in journalism and its solutions in Canada are constructing it, as we've heard, and how others have constructed it, as largely technological and business concerns. This is despite critique, and we've heard it from all of the panelists today, from various publics about structural bias in the media, including a long history of colonialism and racial and gender inequities in journalism in Canada. In addition to decades of concern about concentration of ownership, we're a highly concentrated media industry in Canada, evidence that journalism also has much wider problems. Yet the dominant narrative of the journalism crisis is rooted in the tech-related decline in for-profit media, with gestures to its resolution, funding for the transformation of the existing industry. That journalism insiders and leaders from respected news organizations are sharing advice, analysis, and promoting a specific public policy course is in and of itself relevant to how we understand the state of the industry. However, their experiences and relations within media suggest a certain historical, geographic, and normative slant. For example, one of the main reports on the state of the media in Canada is dismissive of the possible contribution of journalism startups, despite their growth in Canada and globally. The subjectivity of the prominent voices also raises important questions about who and what are being left out. Janet Reutman provides some tools to think about understanding the cycle of crisis more generally as a narrative device. She's found that the framing of a crisis is more often than not rooted in exclusion, and ultimately teleological in both its articulation, what is the crisis, and its solution and resolution. This approach is consistent with critique from postcolonial scholars about the importance of understanding technologies and their development in relationship to larger social systems. And that's what we're trying to do with this book. For example, discussions about the future of media in Canada might be quite different if it was being moderated and led by Anita's founder, Aaron Miller, from Discourse Media. So in closing, the goal of broadening, so I talked about the narrowing that we have, the goal of broadening contributions, participants in Canadian journalism and perspectives was one of my main motives in spending a few years trying to launch the Conversation Canada. Because this model taps into a wide newsroom of academics and scholars as explanatory journalists, as well as areas of critical scholarship that have long critiqued journalism representations and media coverage. So it's broadening the terrain of what is journalism. And while still in its early days, after less than 10 months in operation, and I'm very proud to say this here, the conversation hit a milestone this week of 10 million reads. Wow. So, yeah, it's been... So thank you. And that was good timing, I'm cut off. Okay.
I just want to give anybody... Yes. This one, or this one's fine? Okay, so maybe before we open it up, is there anybody who wants to respond to the other panelists? If not, we'll let you guys. Any questions? It's late in the day, isn't it? You're all thinking about April. I know it.
So,
oh, back there.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Catherine. I actually work in communications for an NGO, but Manel, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. You mentioned meeting interview subjects on their own terms and asking them and interviewing them on their own terms. Do you have any examples of what that would look like and how you should go about doing that as a journalist or a communications professional?
Trying to think through daily, right, doing this show. A lot of the stuff, the way that I've approached it is, because I do these long one-on-one interviews, is I spend a lot of time doing a very particular kind of research. And when I say research, I just don't go back and look at what the person has written. I go back and listen to many, many interviews the person has done, and I look for those moments when they seem completely frustrated with the person who's doing the interview with them. Because I find that people get asked the same question time and time and time again. So I try to find that point of intersection which allows for them to have a more robust conversation of things they want to talk about, because you always get dropped these hints if you listen to previous interviews, but are you going to pick up that nugget and run with it? And sometimes we don't do that. So I look for those moments as well. I also go back and I look for quotes that they find particularly poignant and powerful, and often, again, the interviewer doesn't pick up on those things. Like, that's, for me, is another really important part. And then another thing that I've been doing recently is been thinking a lot about who they acknowledge and why. So I have a segment on my show now, it's called Acknowledgements, where I interview the person and I talk about their new book, but then I turn to the acknowledgements page and I ask them, why do you acknowledge this person? How did this person create a nest of care, a community of care for you? And then that person joins us in conversation for the last half of the interview. And the tone and the tenor of the conversation completely changes because I get out of the way. And that's part of my project if I'm really committed to anti-colonial storytelling. It means me as the host, again, a very ironic use of word, right? This idea of what it means to be a host on, stolen territory for me is really problematic. But when I get out of the way, a different conversation emerges, and that's the power of this anti-colonial storytelling that I'm trying to develop.
Apologies if this question has been answered. I arrived slightly late. I just wondered...
Don't apologize.
I just wondered if the questions that you've been asking today around looking at the structures of colonialism and gender within journalism startups, whether you've been able to have that conversation within more established media organizations in the countries that you work in, and what the response has been. And I'm just asking that question based on my own experience as a journalist who works in the British media. I definitely don't feel comfortable talking about diversity issues in certain spaces because I know it's just going to be shut down or people get quite defensive, and it's just a really difficult discussion to have.
So I'm sure there's a few of us who want to respond, but I'll respond first. So it's a difficult conversation to have. It's interesting because just before we started with the panel, Mary Lynn and I were actually talking about this, and one of the ways that we can talk about it in Canada, at least, is through numbers. Like, there are enough numbers. We just did this op-ed after the Stanley trial verdict, which was one of the trials into somebody who was alleged to have murdered one of the indigenous youth, Colton Bushi. And, you know, what we did is we talked about, so the long documented history of colonial narratives. So thankfully that history exists, but really that book came out only several years ago. So I teach with it and, you know, talk to journalism students about it and then deploy it wherever I can, because it is a documented, you know, history of parodying colonial narratives. You know, and then the second thing we moved to is then talking about what newsrooms look like and what kinds of resources are available for journalists to locate themselves, to understand themselves as working within a settler colonial environment.
So I have one good thing and one bad thing to contribute. The first is, I think in the States, the Me Too movement has been incredibly powerful. But part of that, and I want to give a shout out to the women of Fox News for actually paving the way to move past a partisan discussion of what sexual harassment is all about in news. And so if you look back to sort of the origins of the Me Too movement, I actually think it maybe begins with Fox News and Gretchen Carlson and sort of setting everything off. But what changed was not, and I'm speaking specifically with journalism, was that women were willing to come out, be named, name themselves, and do it as a collective, right? Me Too, right? That is a symbol of collectivity. So I think that there's, I mean, as yucky and terrible as sexual harassment and sexual assault is, the fact that women are coming out, naming themselves, feeling brave, and doing it as a collective, beyond partisanship, beyond type of outlet, is really astounding and amazing. The sort of flip side to that, though, is as part of this, I've reached out to and tried to talk to a lot of already established women leaders. And I won't name names, but in speaking to them, they're sort of the classic denial of gender as an aspect of work, that, you know, speaking about gender as a disadvantage or even an advantage or a problem at all interferes with their narrative of success. So even though some of the newsroom leaders that I spoke to had indeed experienced either sexual assault or sexual harassment, either as part of work or their personal lives, that willingness to engage in a mentorship role where they were willing to talk about this and their role in their career just wasn't present. So it's both good and bad, at least in my work so far.
And I just want to build, is this one on? Okay, I just want to build on what Candace said, because part of what we also did in the op-ed and what we're doing in the book is, you know, Jay Rosen in his lunch talk talked about how audiences are more empowered, and he talked about power as a kind of consumer power, right? They're actually, as members, they're paying more for journalism. But we look at it as actually audiences are talking back on social media. And so in Canada, at least, there's a lot of criticism, really powerful criticism on social media by intellectuals, journalists, activists of mainstream media. You know, Candace showed the tweet there from Jesse Wente saying, you know, we're watching you, Canadian media. So it's not just us, like it's out there. And audiences are appropriately saying, you know, enough.
To the woman who asked that question, I relate to that so hard. It's tough to have those conversations, especially around diversity and gender, even with really open-minded people, which is why at Discourse, we practice radical transparency and radical candor. And so we always try to have open debates because, especially in Canadian culture, we have a tendency to dance around issues, and I think the only way you can actually confront them properly is if you name them. And that's, you know, sometimes it's really uncomfortable, but I've seen people grow so much, and I've also myself grown in terms of how I can set the table for conversation in a way that doesn't get people defensive. But as a person of color and a woman of color, it's a lot of unpaid emotional labor that goes into strategizing ways to bring up diversity and sexism in a way that doesn't fall on deaf ears or gets people to hate you. So what I've done historically is to try to get allies, especially white ones, on the ground who can support you and advocate for you on your behalf. It's something I've found really effective, but there's no clear-cut answer to that.
I agree with everything that they've said here, which is totally thoughtful, so thanks for that. Let me tell you a little story very quickly. Every 2 years I get a phone call, either from some mainstream media organization, and they say, we'd like you to come in and do a little presentation to our staff about why diversity, and notice they say diversity, they don't say equity and inclusion matters. So what I see is that there's this idea of checking off a box of metrics. They're part of this colonial game of improvement and progress. They want to show that there's been progress by bringing somebody like me in to do a little song and dance. But again, that's just an illusion of inclusion, and I don't think there's any kind of real commitment towards equity and thinking about how to make sure that people of color, Black, Indigenous writers actually have a place at the table.
Time for one more question, or maybe if anybody doesn't have a question, or go ahead.
Please stand up. Okay. Hi, I'm Megan Williams. I'm the correspondent for Italy for CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And, you know, everything that you've all said here I think about constantly. And you know, particularly with inclusion of women, I'm constantly trying to make an effort. And in the Italian context, the experts who are constantly proposed to you are, for the most part, men. So, you know, you have to make an effort to try and find women to interview. But when a lot of what I report on is migration, and I'm up against deadlines all the time, so I'm just curious what your experience is in dealing with trying to give someone the time, because oftentimes when you're talking to an immigrant woman who's, you know, or a woman who's in the act of migrating from in trauma, you need time. And for her to tell her story in the way that she wants to tell it, and not just to get the little sound bites that you need for your piece that fit in an already scripted narrative that we've heard 1,000 times. So, I mean, it's wonderful that you have this forum where you have long interviews and you can take the time. And, you know, occasionally if I co-host The Current or whatever, I can do that. But for the most part, you know, there's a lot of deadline pressure, and it's difficult to do that kind of sensitive reporting when you have that. So I'm just curious what your strategies are.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? I don't know if it's... Hello? Okay. So I have one specific strategy. So our gender reporter Emma Jones frequently covers sexual trauma, and a lot of her sources are sexual assault victims. And a lot of them come from impoverished areas. So something that we've been challenging is the concept that you can't somehow compensate your source in some way, which is, I know that's such a taboo thing in journalism. But for example, the way we see it is if a woman who experienced sexual assault is from a rural area, took a bus all the way to meet you to provide an interview, what's the harm in paying for her meal or paying for her bus fare, especially given that she's somebody who doesn't have power in the system. Whereas it's different, say, if you're interviewing Justin Trudeau, who has tons of systemic power. So these are the things that we're trying to explore, though, especially in Canadian media, which veers towards the conservative, in my opinion. It's very touchy. But these are the things that we're exploring, and we're hoping to, I guess, entrench in a style guide down the line. But that's just one example.
I feel for you, because I used to be working on assignment desk at the CBC, and this was my struggle daily, going out with my reporter and trying to cover a story and trying to do it in a subtle and thoughtful way. The one thing I will refer you to that might be helpful, and it might not be, but I'll just gesture to it, is you probably know Marina Hamaneth, who's worked at the Globe and Mail for many years, but now works at University of Toronto. And she's written a really important style guide about how to cover stories about immigration under tight time constraints. And she's been so helpful to me around thinking about these issues, but more, I think also really exciting too, she's been teaching a course at University of Toronto called Covering Immigration, where she delves in deep into how to do this when you have no time or the resources to do it as well as you can. So.
Where do we find that style guide? I'm so glad you have interest in it, because I'm going to tell my boss. We actually haven't developed, this is something that's a massive priority for me. Hello? Oh yeah. It's a huge priority for me to work on, but we just want to be very, I guess, thoughtful about it and consult academics and consult stakeholders first. But I mean, if we can trade information, and I'm more than happy to provide it to you once it's available. Okay. You should also tweet it to everybody on this hashtag. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're kind of at time, and I'm sure everybody's got some reservations waiting for them. Do you guys want to have like 30 seconds to a minute each? Wrap it up.
So the question is, who isn't in this room that needs to be here? And I would argue that a fair number of media executives should be in this room and are not, right? Look around. And even you can't control panel times, but maybe you can, right? And so the fact that there's a self-conscious awareness that this is a problem is awesome. But the people who need to hear it need to be here. And so you guys are now tasked with being evangelists.
Yeah, we talked about, we're on the farthest edges geographically of the conference on the end of the day, on the 13th day. Anyways, we were just, but so we noted the kind of geographic distancing, and Manal helped us understand that from a geographer's perspective. So I would reiterate Nikki's points that, it would be great to see these questions raised in the main lunch speakers, and that these issues, that's why we're doing this book, is persistent critique that is still, for decades, that is still not being integrated in the technology conversations.
So I will do a shameless plug, but not just for my benefit. It's just because I really believe in the organization I work for, and we are funded solely, or we're trying to be funded solely by members, and our approach to journalism, which is quite unique, not just for Canada, but globally, will not be able to survive without the support of the public. So I would urge you guys to check out the discourse.ca and support us in any way you can, even if you could just spread the gospel. Thank you.
I want to end with this, just thinking about the extraordinary comments I've heard from the panelists today. There's this incredibly ambiguous geographical question that has totally torn me up since I was a kid to now around my identity, because I'm a mixed race person, is this question, where are you from? And I get asked this all the time, particularly here right now while I'm in Italy. But recently I've been really shaped by the work of another Black feminist scholar named Catherine McKittrick, and she says we need to shift this question from where are you from to where do you know from? So what are the communities that infuse you, inspire you, help you think about the way that you tell stories? And that's something that's really helping me, and I hope it'll help some of you too.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think Megan's question really illustrates how tough it is to put all of this into practice, and how our structures and forms and styles that we have for journalism fail us in many ways. Even whilst we try to establish relationships and greater degrees of accuracy and greater